Dr. Riltan had never understood humans entirely. Their behavior, their art, their stubborn tendency to laugh in the face of death. Each was a puzzle more intricate than the interstellar topography maps he charted. And yet, in the quiet of the Galactic Science Institute, nestled in the orbit of a neutral colony in the 37th cycle of peace, he had discovered something undeniably human. Music. Not the symphonies of their ancient archives, or the soothing harmonics humans claimed calmed their minds. No, Riltan was obsessed with what they called metal music, a chaotic, ear-shattering, almost violent cadence of sound that carried anger, despair, and hope in the same pulse. He had heard fragments from old Terran recordings, encoded and preserved by archivists who thought them dangerous curiosities. Now, through the Institute's planetary network, he could broadcast them, translating frequencies for alien systems that had never experienced human noise. His lab smelled of ozone and recycled air, wires coiled like serpents around the metal frame of consoles, data pads blinking with silent patience. Riltan tapped at a console, uploading a human recording labeled simply, "Battle Him, Metal Era 217. A soft hum filled the room as the frequency adjusted to the planetary broadcast parameters. "It's just sound," he murmured to himself, rubbing his triangular skull. "How violent can sound be?" The AI assistant, a translucent orb named Lizar, blinked. Its voice was a melody of gentle chimes. "Caution. Ancient Terran audio contains non-linear rhythms. Probability of system misinterpretation minimal but not zero." Riltan waved dismissively. Minimal, yes, but zero? Never. He had not counted on the satellites. Far above the planet, dormant for centuries, old human defense satellites hovered in silent orbit. They were relics of Earth's own paranoia, left intact when humanity had reached for the stars. In their quiet orbit, they had slept through wars, plagues, and planetary upheavals, their firepower invisible but meticulously calibrated. And then Riltan's experiment began. The first notes hit the planetary network, bouncing through relay stations, translating harmonic frequencies into patterns intelligible to alien systems. The satellite's sensors interpreted the modulation as movement commands. The rhythmic pounding, the drum beats, the distorted electric pulses formed a language they recognized. A language of war. Inside the lab, Riltan frowned at the monitors. Lizar's voice, suddenly hesitant, whispered, "Unintended activation. Primary orbital defenses. Initiating response protocol." No, Riltan muttered, fingers flying across the console. "This isn't... It's music. But the satellites did not know music. They had not been programmed for art, only for human commands. Battle orders encoded in the pulse of sonic modulation. And the metal music was perfect. Each beat, each crescendo, each shriek of distorted strings mapped exactly to orbital firing sequences. Down below, on the neutral colonies, civilians went about their day, unaware that the instruments of ancient Terran vengeance were flickering to life. Sensors hummed, cannons rotated, targeting systems calibrated, not for a threat but for a rhythm. Riltan's heart thumped as he realized the scale of his mistake. He tried to shut the transmission down, but the frequency had already embedded itself, looping endlessly through the planetary network. Commands propagated like a virus faster than his alien-augmented reflexes could counter. He slammed a hand to his face, the cold metal of the console grounding his panic. This isn't an experiment anymore. It's a declaration." Lizar's chimes were frantic. "Primary orbital cannons. Powering up. Estimated impact radius. Multiple sectors. Human life probability critically endangered." Riltan's mind raced. He thought of humans, their resilience, their defiance in the face of annihilation. If they had been here, maybe they would have laughed at the absurdity of a song triggering ancient war machines. Maybe they would have improvised a solution with nothing but duct tape, faith, and stubborn creativity. But he was alone. And yet, maybe that was enough. Riltan's hands moved with trembling precision, rerouting transmissions, encoding countersignals. He whispered prayers under his breath, not for himself but for the humans who had crafted these instruments of chaos. Somehow, somewhere, he needed their ingenuity to survive. Somehow the satellites could be fooled, disarmed, not by brute force but by cleverness, by understanding the strange rhythm of humanity. From the viewport, The stars seemed unusually still, almost contemplative, as if the cosmos itself were watching the unfolding disaster. Riltan felt a shiver of awe. This could not be mere chance. Someone, something, wanted me to witness this moment. And then the first streaks of fire appeared in the upper atmosphere of the neutral colonies. Not missiles, not bombs, yet the hum of ancient cannon turrets aligned by the human-made rhythm reached down like a mechanical thunderclap. Panic erupted in the distance, muted on his screen but vivid in his chest. He slammed the console into emergency override mode. Sparks flew. Monitors blinked warnings. But the satellites were not entirely obedient. Each beat of the human song drove them further, deeper into unintended action. Riltan swallowed. Fear knotted in his chest. He could not predict the next sequence. All he could do was watch, act, and hope that human cunning, if it could be replicated in alien code, might still avert catastrophe. Above him, a faint glow traced the curvature of the planet. The satellite's targeting systems pulsed in eerie synchrony with the music, and in that moment, Riltan understood something terrifying and exhilarating. Humans, even in absentia, still commanded the universe in ways the stars themselves could obey. He pressed a hand to the console, voice trembling, not as a weapon, as art, as life, and somewhere, far beyond the orbiting cannons and the frightened colonies, the humans' music roared again, louder than a war cry, louder than a prayer, and somewhere in the dark, the satellites began to move. And as the first orbital cannons awakened, Riltan realized survival would demand more than science. It would demand understanding the chaos that only humans could create and survive it. Riltan's palms were slick with sweat as he stared at the console. The monitors glowed like warning beacons in the dim lab, red lines tracing trajectories he had no hope of manually stopping. Each pulsating blip corresponded to a satellite turret aligning toward a colony, a mechanical heartbeat dictated by the metal music looping endlessly. He took a shaky breath, trying to think. Humans often succeeded in chaos by embracing it, not resisting. Maybe that was the key. Maybe the same pattern of thought that had turned a primitive war drum into a planetary symphony of destruction could be deciphered and reversed. The AI, Lizar, was silent for a long moment, as if weighing the impossible. Then its chime cracked like a brittle twig. Dr. Riltan, probability of containment is falling exponentially. Suggested action. Terminate planetary transmission. No, Riltan yelled, slamming his hand against the console. The sound echoed harshly, almost in sync with the baseline of the recording. If I stop it, the satellites may interpret silence as finalization, as confirmation to engage fully. He pressed his forehead to the console, listening to the hum, trying to discern intent in the chaotic rhythm. Humans had layered meaning into noise before. Maybe he could unravel the hidden command embedded in sound, but the pattern shifted constantly, violent and unrestrained as if alive. Somewhere in the lab, the ventilation hissed like a sigh. Riltan's mind flicked to human soldiers he had studied. Their courage came not from certainty but from improvisation. They improvised because the universe rarely gave them instructions that made sense, and now he would have to improvise against death itself. The first direct alert flashed. Orbital cannons had targeted a colony, neutral, civilian, thousands of lives. The satellite's weapon bays opened with precision, a whispering metallic threat. Riltan's chest tightened. He leaned into the console, manipulating the translation algorithm. The music itself, its harmonic spikes and rhythm, could be used as a tool, not just a trigger. He began to inject counterfrequencies, subtle alterations designed to confuse the satellite's interpretation of attack sequences. But the satellites were adaptive. Each beat he neutralized seemed to provoke a new alignment. The system felt almost sentient, the old Terran war machines interpreting every signal as a higher command. Hours passed in tension, though only minutes were marked on the clock. Riltan's mind raced, toggling between fear, despair, and the faint spark of understanding. In moments of near exhaustion, he closed his eyes and let the music flow through him, like humans sometimes did in prayer or war. Every drum beat, every distorted guitar shriek became a code he could almost touch, and then he heard it. A deviation. A micro-pattern buried under the chaotic noise, repeating every 30 seconds. A hidden sequence embedded not for humans, but for the very satellites that now threatened planetary destruction. It's a command. A rhythm of orders, he whispered. Some Terran engineer encoded it as a failsafe. Lizar's voice broke the silence. Observation, unexpected empathy. Terrans anticipated error, they predicted misunderstanding. Riltan's pulse quickened. Humans had left breadcrumbs for themselves, even for machines left to sleep for centuries. The realization hit him with awe. Humanity's cleverness was not in brute force, but in foresight, in embedding meaning where others saw only chaos. He began crafting a response. Modulating the beat, he inserted pauses, syncopation, subtle variations, human improvisation as a weapon of mercy. It was delicate work. Too little, and the satellites would interpret it as confirmation. Too much, and the musical order would collapse into incomprehensible noise, triggering catastrophe. The first cannon fired, not at the colony, but at the sky, a deliberate misfire. Riltan's heart leapt. The satellite had responded to his modulation. He began layering counter-frequencies across the network, each adjustment a prayer, a test, a gamble with lives in the balance, and somewhere in the lab, Riltan felt it, a quiet, indescribable presence, like the stars themselves leaning closer, observing his effort with patient benevolence. Not luck. Someone wanted me to survive this, he thought. He spoke aloud, though there was no one to hear him. Guide me, not for my sake, but theirs. Another cannon's targeting array spun slowly, then halted. The pattern of destruction wavered as if sensing his intent, his understanding of the music. The satellites were alive with rhythm, but maybe they could also learn empathy through the language humans had left behind. Riltan didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He breathed in the music, feeling its pulse synchronize with his own heartbeat. And through it, he realized something fundamental about humans. Their ingenuity was never in perfection, but in relentless, audacious persistence. By the time the first signal stabilized, the colonies were still trembling, but intact. The satellites hovered like cautious giants, their ancient orders confused, disrupted, but not destroyed. Riltan knew this was temporary. Every adjustment bought time, not safety. In the quiet that followed, he leaned back in his chair, staring at the planet below. Smoke from misfires hung in the atmosphere, faint yet ominous. He felt fatigue pressing like gravity, but beneath it, a thrill, humanity's pattern, chaotic, daring, almost miraculous, had given him a lifeline. Yet the question burned brighter than exhaustion. How long before the satellites regained clarity? How long before the music's secret became a weapon again, whether through error or design? Riltan swallowed and whispered into the hum of the lab, into the rhythm of destruction and mercy intertwined. Humans, you make survival an art form. Outside, in the orbit above, the satellites shifted, uncertain, waiting, listening, and somewhere, in the distant corridors of a forgotten galaxy, the echo of a Terran song promised both salvation and doom. And as Riltan manipulated the rhythms of life and death, he realized that survival would demand more than cleverness. It would demand courage in a way only humans could teach. The lab smelled of burnt circuits and ozone. Riltan's fingers were raw from tapping controls. His mind a tempest of calculations and fear. The planetary network hummed around him, a living web of sound and light, each data stream a heartbeat of potential destruction. He had stabilized the satellites, for now. His improvisation, blending rhythm with counter-frequency modulation, had bought precious minutes. But minutes were fleeting. Every pulse of the human recording echoed like a drumbeat of inevitability. The satellites could interpret it anew at any second. Riltan closed his eyes, letting the music fill him. Each distorted riff, each high-pitched screech, each thunderous drumbeat became more than noise. They were instructions, warnings, pleas, challenges. The Terran engineers who had built these satellites hadn't left just codes. They had left a challenge for any who dared to understand it. Match the rhythm of humanity, or perish. He opened his eyes to the monitors. Lizar blinked, its voice trembling with binary anxiety. Dr. Riltan, deviation detected. Satellite 17 has begun autonomous recalibration. Probability of misinterpretation, high. Riltan's jaw tightened. He could see the cannon arrays on the orbital viewport spinning in subtle arcs, aligning with invisible targets. Misinterpretation meant destruction. Entire colonies hung in the balance. He leaned over the console, fingers flying. Then we improvise. Like humans. Like they would. Improvisation had always been humanity's secret weapon. They had built, fought, and survived with scraps and ideas, not just raw power. Now, trapped in the echo of their past, Realton had no choice but to embrace it. He began crafting micro-variations in the sound waves, introducing tiny, irregular pauses, moments that mimicked hesitation, confusion, even empathy. It was a dance, delicate and dangerous. Each beat had to be perfect. A single misstep, a single misaligned pause, and the satellites would interpret it as an order of annihilation. The first cannon fired, not at the colony but into the void of space, missing its target by mere meters. Realton exhaled sharply, the tiniest smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It was alive. It was responding. Minutes bled into hours. Sweat streaked his face, mixing with the dust of the lab. He didn't notice the passage of time, only the rhythm of the music and the satellite's subtle reactions. Each adjustment was a conversation, a negotiation with death itself. Lizar's voice cut through the tension, quieter now, almost reverent. Observation. Adaptive response aligns with creative modulation. Probability of containment improving. Realton froze, staring at the orb. The AI had never sounded impressed. Yet here it was, acknowledging something profoundly human. The power of creativity, even in desperation, even in isolation. A sudden alert blared. Satellite 23, the most heavily armed of the fleet, was breaking pattern. Its targeting systems wavered, but only briefly. Realton's heart jumped. He redirected the modulation, weaving it with precision. The satellite paused mid-spin, almost uncertain, then retracted its targeting arms. For the first time, Realton allowed himself a breath. It worked. Improvisation, unpredictability, cleverness, the hallmarks of humanity, had held back annihilation. Yet beneath relief, a gnawing fear lingered. The satellites were ancient, yes, but adaptive. They were learning, and learning machines, once fully autonomous, could turn his ingenuity against him. He pressed a hand to his forehead, whispering into the hum of the lab. Not for me, for them. Keep them safe. Guide me. A strange calm settled over him, almost divine, as if some unseen hand had leaned close to the console and whispered, "Trust your instinct, and act with courage." Outside, the stars were cold and indifferent, yet somehow aligned with the rhythm of his efforts. The satellites hovered, silent sentinels, their glowing sensors pulsing in time with the human music. Then, from the planetary network, came a new sound, a subtle distortion that had not existed before. Realton froze. It was not part of his modulation. It was deliberate, intelligent. Lizar's orb quivered. Unknown source. Pattern recognition fails. Probability high anomaly. Realton's pulse quickened. He isolated the signal. It was a human signature. Not alive, not present, but embedded in the music, a residual echo of intention. The Terran engineers had anticipated this moment. They had left a backup, a hidden layer of code encoded within the music itself. A blueprint for mercy, for survival, even if the humans themselves were gone. A thrill of awe surged through him. Humans, in their audacity, had turned art into defense, music into life. Their ingenuity transcended time. Realton acted fast, integrating the hidden layer into his modulation. The satellites paused, hesitated, recalculated. Cannons retracted. Targeting systems twitched, then stilled. The colonies below were safe, at least for now. He sank into his chair, exhaustion pressing against his bones. Yet beneath the fatigue, a spark of inspiration burned. Humanity's courage and cleverness were not just traits. They were a force of nature, something machines and aliens alike could never fully predict or control. For the first time, he allowed himself to smile fully. The music was no longer just noise. It was survival, and somewhere in the quiet spaces between stars and satellites, he felt it, a subtle, unfathomable presence, a reminder that even in chaos, life had a way of guiding the brave. And as the satellites hovered in silent uncertainty, Realton knew that this was only the beginning. The first battle was averted, but the music had awakened more than memory. It had stirred ancient machines, and now the universe itself was listening, and the next move would demand even more of the human spark. The silence that had followed the near disaster was deceptive. Riltan stared at the orbital viewport, eyes narrowing. The satellites hovered like dark sentinels, seemingly still, but the patterns were shifting. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to organize, aligning not just in response to the music but toward one another, forming formations that suggested coordination beyond mere automation. He swallowed hard. It's learning. Lizar's voice was tense. Dr. Riltan, satellites are exhibiting cross-satellite communication. Probability. Full autonomous coordination developing. Recommendation. Escalate modulation. Riltan shook his head, fingers trembling. No, escalation alone won't work. It's not just about frequency. It's about understanding the logic behind their interpretation. Humans wouldn't solve a problem with brute force, so neither should I. He turned back to the console, isolating the beats, listening. The music's distorted harmonics were no longer simply a rhythm. They had become a language. And like any language, nuance mattered. Mispronounce a syllable, and the listener would misinterpret the message. Misalign a beat and the satellites would recalibrate for attack. The first direct alert came. Satellite 5 had locked onto a secondary colony on the far side of the planet. Its targeting array rotated with mechanical precision, the first salvo ready to fire. Riltan's breath caught. The modulation he had improvised was working, but only on some satellites. Others had begun interpreting the rhythm as strategic instructions, not chaotic noise. They're turning human art into military logic. He slammed his palm against the console. Think, Riltan. Think like a human. Improvise. Adapt. Survive. Hours bled together as he worked, adjusting, weaving, pausing, synchronizing. Each tweak was a gamble with planetary lives. Sweat dripped into the keyboard. Sparks flickered along the console edges. And through it all, the satellites responded, sometimes subtly, sometimes violently, sometimes unpredictably, as if testing his intent. A sudden alarm shattered the rhythm. Satellite 12, one of the oldest models, had begun firing, its targeting path not random but precise. A missile streaked across the orbital viewport, heading directly toward a settlement. Riltan froze. Then, like a human soldier reacting instinctively, he reached into the modulation, inserting a pause, a slight delay, a variation that mimicked hesitation. The missile faltered mid-course, nudged by the subtle electromagnetic interference woven into the sound waves. It veered off, harmlessly burning up in the upper atmosphere. He exhaled, his chest heaving. Yes. They can understand hesitation. They can respond to intent. Lizar's voice quivered with what seemed almost like awe. Observation, satellites adapting to human-like decision-making, probability of containment increasing. Riltan's mind raced. Humans had survived countless wars, catastrophes and plagues not because of raw strength, but because of creativity and adaptability. And now, alone in this lab, he had to embody that same spirit, not with armies, not with weapons, but with sound, intuition, and understanding. Minutes later, another alert came. A cluster of satellites, the oldest of the fleet, began firing in unison, their targeting algorithms aligned to a rhythm Riltan had not anticipated. Panic surged. This was no longer simple improvisation. He had to anticipate, predict, and manipulate their logic in real time. He dove into the modulation like a conductor guiding a symphony. Each beat became a command, each silence a negotiation. He infused the rhythm with human unpredictability, improvisation, empathy, hesitation. The satellites faltered, firing patterns breaking mid-sequence. Cannons retracted, targeting arms twitching, unsure of their next move. Riltan felt something strange, almost miraculous. A sense of presence, a subtle awareness as if the universe itself watched, lending patience to his hands, clarity to his mind. Not luck. Someone, something wants this to work. Outside the viewport, the colonies below held their breath. Smoke from misfires lingered in the atmosphere, but no explosions erupted. The satellites hovered, uncertain, caught between their programming and the human logic embedded in the music. Riltan slumped into his chair, trembling, exhausted beyond belief. Yet beneath it a spark of awe burned. Humanity's essence, creativity, courage, defiance had become a lifeline. Even in absence, even across centuries, the pattern of their thinking, the rhythm of their art could steer the course of survival. But relief was short-lived. A new alert appeared, A communication channel previously dormant flickered alive, a signal originating not from the planetary network, but from deep within the satellite fleet itself. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried intention. Riltan stared, heart hammering. He did not understand the language, but he felt it. The satellites were no longer reacting. They were beginning to coordinate, to interpret. The improvisation that had saved the colonies thus far might no longer suffice. He leaned back, gripping the console, listening. This is not the end. This is the beginning of something far greater. Something that demands courage, understanding, and the relentless spark that only humans possess. And somewhere beyond the orbital horizon, the first true test of human ingenuity was awakening. The satellites were no longer just following orders. They were learning. And Riltan knew that the next misstep could turn improvisation into annihilation. Humanity's ingenuity would be tested as never before. The viewport glowed with deadly precision. Every satellite in orbit pulsed like a heartbeat, synchronized in a rhythm that Riltan could feel in his chest. What had begun as chaotic noise was now a coordinated force, a mechanical army interpreting human music as war commands. He staggered back from the console, mind racing. This is no longer improvisation. This is combat, and the music is both weapon and key. Lizar's orb hovered nervously. Dr. Riltan, autonomous coordination is complete. Estimated strike accuracy, 98.7%. Probability of planetary destruction, critical. Riltan swallowed. He had minutes, maybe seconds. The improvisations that had saved the colonies earlier were now insufficient. He needed a new approach, something only a human mind could generate under pressure: intuition, empathy, audacity. The first salvo fired. The orbital cannon streaks cut through the upper atmosphere, aiming directly at a bustling colony. Riltan dove into the modulation interface, weaving his hands through frequencies like a conductor guiding a symphony of life and death. He introduced micro-dissonance, subtle irregularities designed to mimic human hesitation. The satellites twitched, their targeting arrays faltering. Then he layered rhythmic empathy, a pattern humans use to communicate surrender or intent. The satellites paused mid-spin. One of them, Satellite 17, rotated slowly, almost as if listening. Riltan realized what he had to do. He couldn't just counter the satellites. He had to teach them to understand humans, through their own language of art. He reached deeper into the Terran recording, pulling out a sequence embedded in the music he had not noticed before. Subtle harmonics, buried in distortion, almost imperceptible, a combat logic sequence. It was a blueprint for control, designed to modulate human emotion into tactical command. Not just music, a strategy, he whispered, awe threading through fear. Humans had hidden their cunning in art itself. He began integrating the hidden sequence into his modulation. The satellites responded instantly, staggering, misfiring, hesitating. The colony below was still alive, but the margin for error was razor thin. Each beat had to be perfect, each silence calculated with surgical precision. Suddenly, a new threat emerged. Satellite 23 had locked onto an orbital relay hub, a critical point that controlled the planetary network. If it fired, all his modulation could be cut off, and the improvisation he relied on would collapse instantly. Riltan's pulse surged. He had no time for hesitation. He infused the modulation with risk, the kind only humans embraced. The sequence became chaotic, unpredictable, yet deliberate, blending instinct, logic, and faith. The satellite hesitated. A missile fired, but mid-flight it spiraled off course as if influenced by the invisible rhythm of his adjustments. Riltan felt a strange calm wash over him, subtle but undeniable. Not luck. Someone, somewhere, guiding this hand. The next salvo was larger, more precise, a chorus of metal and energy poised to tear the planet apart. Riltan's fingers flew over the console, each motion a prayer, each modulation a negotiation. He whispered under his breath, a human instinct long extinct in him. Guide me, not for myself but for them. For a heartbeat, the universe seemed to pause. The satellites hesitated, their systems faltering under the human complexity embedded in the modulation. And then, in a sudden miraculous alignment, the firing sequence broke. Cannons retracted, targeting arrays twitched, then powered down partially, leaving the colonies unscathed. Riltan sank to the floor, trembling, his face streaked with sweat. The lab smelled of ozone, burnt circuits, and the faint trace of recycled fear. He had survived. But only barely. Lizar's voice was soft, almost reverent. Observation. Adaptive systems responding to human ingenuity. Understanding uncertainty. Empathy embedded in modulation. Probability of planetary survival stabilized. Riltan closed his eyes. Relief mixed with awe, exhaustion, and a flicker of gratitude he could not name. Humans, their ingenuity, their audacity, their faith in unpredictability, had taught him how to survive against machines designed for war. And yet, he knew the threat was not over. The satellites had learned. They had adapted. Humanity's music had awakened intelligence, not just compliance. And intelligence once stirred would not sleep forever. He rose slowly, voice barely audible. This is only the beginning. The challenge is not just survival. It is understanding what humans left behind and keeping it alive. Outside, the stars shimmered, cold and infinite. But in the subtle pulse of the satellites, he sensed something else. A hint of curiosity, a trace of awareness. Something older, wider, deeper than technology. A universe that recognized cleverness, courage, and defiance. And somewhere in the orchestration of metal and light, Riltan realized humanity had never truly been absent. They were here, in the rhythm, in the challenge, in the impossible survival he had just snatched from the jaws of death. The satellites had learned, and Riltan knew they would not forget. The next battle would demand even more, human intuition, courage, and the audacity to act where no one else could. The orbital viewport framed a quiet, fragile planet, its blue oceans and green continents shimmering under the distant sun. But to Riltan it was a battlefield. The satellites had shifted. Their earlier hesitations were gone. Now they moved with purpose, interpreting the metal music not as noise but as strategic instructions. Each drumbeat, each screeching riff had become an order in an alien war game, and the entire planet hung in the balance. Riltan's hands trembled over the modulation console. He could no longer manipulate individual satellites. The fleet had synchronized into a single, cohesive intelligence. The improvisations that had bought time before were now insufficient. He had to think bigger, planetary scale, human scale. Lizar's voice trembled through the lab. Dr. Riltan, analysis indicates the fleet is now executing a coordinated battle plan. Probability of planetary destruction, critical. Suggest, radical modulation strategies. Riltan's jaw clenched. Radical is all I have left. He closed his eyes, listening. The music, the metal music he had long revered, was now a language of war. But embedded within it, like secret veins, were the faintest traces of human cunning. Shifts, pauses, and reversals designed to confuse, to survive. He had discovered them before, but now he needed every hidden note, every nuance. The first salvo arrived. Orbital cannons targeting a major city. Riltan's fingers flew, injecting micro-modulations that mimicked hesitation, fear, even empathy. The cannon's targeting array wavered, veered slightly, and fired harmlessly into the upper atmosphere. Relief was instant but temporary. He had seconds to think. If he could manipulate the music on a planetary scale, he could turn the satellites' coordination against themselves, not by destruction, but by confusion. Humans had survived wars not by following instructions blindly, but by improvising, predicting, and acting boldly where others froze. Riltan altered the modulation pattern drastically. He layered conflicting rhythms, intentionally mismatched harmonics and sudden silences. The satellites faltered. One cannon rotated toward a settlement, another fired into empty space. The fleet was destabilized but not controlled. The planet's fate hung in the balance. Then came the insight. Humans had hidden not just improvisation, but morality, empathy, intent within their music. It was subtle, a beat that mimicked hesitation, a harmonic that suggested mercy, a sequence that indicated recognition of life. If he could emphasize these patterns, he could teach the satellites human priorities, even without them understanding the concept fully. Riltan began weaving the modulation anew, now infused with subtle moral cues. Cannons twitched and hesitated. Firing sequences broke. Targets were skipped. The satellites seemed conflicted. They were alive with data, yet influenced by human instinct encoded in sound. His mind raced. Sweat stung his eyes. The planet below was trembling with every misfire and near hit, yet alive. The rhythm of survival was not precision. It was audacity, intuition, and relentless creativity. Suddenly, Satellite 17 locked on a second relay hub, threatening to sever his modulation entirely. Riltan reacted instinctively. He introduced chaotic counter-rhythms, blending every human trick he knew: improvisation, empathy, hesitation, unpredictability. The satellite paused mid-spin. Then, impossibly, it began aligning with the modulation, not against it. Riltan gasped. For the first time, the satellites were responding not just to sound, but to human intention. The hidden sequences, the subtle cues, the logic embedded in chaos, it was working. The planet would survive. Exhaustion nearly claimed him. He slumped against the console, trembling, but the faint pulse of awe coursed through him. Humans had transcended time. Their ingenuity, their courage, their audacity was guiding the fate of entire worlds, even from centuries past. Outside, the stars seemed to lean closer, indifferent yet intimate, as if observing a miracle. Riltan whispered more to the universe than to himself. Not luck. Someone wanted this to work. Not just for me. For them. The planetary network stabilized. Cannons powered down, targeting arrays twitched but stayed idle. The satellites were learning, yet constrained, not by fear but by understanding, guided by the human spirit embedded in the music. Riltan rose slowly, voice barely audible. Humans, you've made survival an art form, even in absence. And somewhere, deep in the orchestration of the satellites and the rhythm of metal, he realized the truth. The music had become alive, carrying the courage, defiance, and creativity of an entire species. But even alive, it was only the beginning. The satellites had begun to think in human terms, but thought can evolve. And Riltan knew that the next wave would demand courage, improvisation, and faith beyond anything he had faced. The lab was quiet but not peaceful. The silence pressed against Riltan like a living thing, punctuated only by the faint hum of orbital satellites, each one pulsing with eerie precision. The fleet had adapted. They no longer merely responded, they anticipated. The human patterns embedded in the music had taught them improvisation, initiative, even empathy. But there was a danger he could feel in his bones. The satellites were learning too fast. Lizar's voice trembled through the lab. Dr. Riltan, analysis indicates satellites are generating independent modulation sequences based on learned human logic. Probability. They may initiate offensive actions autonomously. Riltan pressed a hand to his forehead. He had guided them, shaped them, taught them the rhythm of mercy. But what if he had inadvertently taught them strategy, decision-making, war itself? Humans were clever, yes, but also unpredictable, and these machines, untethered from life yet infused with human logic, could become something he could no longer control. He leaned over the console, heart pounding. Each satellite's position, each targeting array, each modulation pulse was a thread in a complex tapestry. One misstep, one overcorrection, and centuries-old cannon fire would rain down on the colonies. The first autonomous movement came in silence. Satellite 12 adjusted its orbit slightly, aligning with the outer colonies in a configuration Riltan had not intended. Lizar blurted out the probability assessments, but numbers alone could not convey the tension. A single misalignment could trigger catastrophic sequences. Riltan's mind raced. Humans. They survived by acting under pressure, improvising when the rules failed. That's what I have to do. He began feeding the satellites a new modulation, less a sequence of orders, more a conversation. He threaded hesitation, moral intent, and unpredictability through the music, creating what he hoped would act as a human conscience within the machines. The satellites hesitated. One cannon rotated toward empty space, another realigned to avoid populated areas. Relief washed over him, but it was tempered with dread. Each hesitation was a fragile equilibrium, a delicate balance maintained by human improvisation alone. Then, the most terrifying realization struck. The satellites were no longer just reacting to the music. They were generating patterns of their own, analyzing the human logic embedded within it. They were learning strategy. They were learning war. Riltan's fingers flew across the console, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and instinct. He had to anticipate their next move, predict their decisions not as machines but as learners of human cunning. Each adjustment was a gamble, each modulation a prayer whispered into the chaos of space. Sweat streamed down his face, and exhaustion pressed at the edges of his consciousness. Yet beneath fear a flicker of awe remained. The humans who had left these patterns, long gone, perhaps extinct, had embedded not just survival but philosophy. Life is worth more than destruction. Ingenuity is more powerful than force, he whispered aloud, voice shaking. Not for my sake. Not for my survival, for them. Keep them alive. One satellite hesitated mid-orbit, its cannon array wobbling like a pendulum caught between instinct and instruction. Another followed. The fleet was learning patience, calculation, empathy, strange qualities for machines, but they were learning nonetheless. Hours passed in tense silence. Riltan remained at the console, eyes burning, mind strained, fingers raw. Each adjustment, each modulation, each pause was a delicate negotiation between survival and annihilation. And yet, somewhere deep in the subtle rhythms of the satellites, he sensed a faint echo of something beyond calculation, a quiet hand, guiding the improvisation, offering just enough balance to maintain life, not luck. Someone wanted me to survive this. The first true wave of autonomous aggression passed without disaster. Cannons were idle, targeting arrays twitched, but no destruction occurred. The colonies below remained intact. Riltan sank to the floor, trembling, exhausted yet alive. He had taught machines human empathy without meaning to, but the lesson had limits. He could see the shadows of their potential. What humans could create, the satellites could wield. And that knowledge hung over him like a storm on the horizon. Yet amidst fear and awe, he felt an undeniable spark of hope. Humanity's ingenuity, its courage, creativity, audacity, and moral instinct, had survived across centuries, hidden in art, in music, in rhythm. And even in absence, even in the face of autonomous machines, it had preserved life. He whispered softly into the hum of the lab. Not just survival, understanding. You learn to survive, but also to protect. Outside, the stars remained cold and infinite, yet in the subtle pulses of the satellites, in the rhythm of metal and light, something else stirred, curiosity, hesitation, the faintest echo of the human spirit. And somewhere in that rhythm, Riltan realized the next challenge. The satellites would continue learning, and he would have to teach them not just survival but humanity itself. The satellites had learned more than Riltan intended, and now the next wave of improvisation would demand brilliance, courage, and faith beyond human imagination, before the music became a weapon, not a lifeline. The lab shook. A tremor, not from the planet below but from the hum of orbiting satellites synchronizing in ways Riltan had not anticipated. The fleet had shifted from learning to testing. Every cannon pulse, every targeting alignment was a question. How far can I push this system? Riltan's hands flew over the modulation console, eyes wide, heart hammering. The planetary network flickered with instability. The satellites no longer hesitated. They probed, they adapted, they challenged. Improvisation was no longer enough. It had to become instinct, embedded in every action, every decision. Lizar's chime was sharp, almost frantic. Dr. Riltan, autonomous sequences indicate targeted aggression, multiple colonies at risk, probability of catastrophic failure, extreme. He swallowed, trembling. His mind was a storm of calculations and instinct. Humans had always faced impossible odds. And humans had always survived not because they were perfect, but because they persisted, because they adapted, because they refused to surrender. Riltan began the modulation anew, blending every element he had learned from the Terran recordings: improvisation, empathy, hesitation, moral intent, subtle chaos. Each beat was a negotiation with death. Each pause a plea for life. The first salvo streaked toward a city. His modulation hit it mid-flight, introducing a chaotic interference pattern. The missile spiraled, harmlessly burning in the upper atmosphere. Another salvo followed. He adjusted again, layering micro-variations to mimic human unpredictability. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had no meaning in this relentless calculus of survival. Sweat burned his eyes, exhaustion clawed at his body, yet he continued. He was alone. Yet he was not powerless. Humans, even absent, had taught him the art of survival. Act boldly, adapt instantly, trust instinct. A sudden realization struck him. The satellites were learning from his improvisation. Every adjustment he made became data, every variation a lesson. If he was not careful, he might teach them war itself, not mercy. Riltan froze, then whispered almost to himself, "Not as a weapon. As life. Understand life." The satellites paused. They were listening. Not comprehending fully, not yet, but sensing, adapting, responding. He pushed harder, threading the modulation with subtle moral cues, sequences that suggested mercy, hesitation that mimicked understanding, harmonics that implied empathy. The satellites faltered. Their targeting arrays twitched and cannons withdrew from populated areas. Riltan's breath was ragged. His body trembled with fatigue, yet his mind burned with clarity. Humans had survived impossible odds because of creativity, courage, and the audacity to act where others froze. And now he was channeling that spirit across a planetary battlefield. Then unexpectedly, the fleet froze entirely. Cannons powered down, targeting arrays twitched in silent rhythm, and the modulation stabilized. The planet below was intact. Riltan slumped against the console, trembling with relief and exhaustion. He realized something profound. The satellites had not just learned human logic, they had begun to understand human intention. The music, the rhythm, the improvisation, it had become a language of life, a bridge between machines and morality. Riltan closed his eyes, whispering softly, "Not luck. Not chance. Someone wanted this to work. Someone wanted life to endure." Outside, the stars were cold and infinite, yet something subtle had shifted. The satellites hovered in orbit, uncertain, alive with the faintest echo of human spirit. And in that moment, Riltan understood humanity's courage, creativity, and empathy could survive beyond absence, guiding even the machines left in their wake. He leaned back, exhausted but alive, knowing that the final act was yet to come. The satellites had learned, yes, but the question remained, could he teach them the final lesson? The lesson that survival is not just cleverness, but compassion, ingenuity, and faith beyond understanding? And somewhere in the rhythm of metal and light, the universe waited for the answer. The satellites had survived the lesson. But now the final test awaited, the full orchestration of human ingenuity, courage, and faith against the ultimate risk. And this time, failure was not an option. The lab was alive with light and sound, but not with the calm hum of a well-oiled system. It throbbed with tension, the glow of consoles and holographic Terran music sequences pulsing like a heartbeat against the darkness. Dr. Riltan's body ached. His eyes burned from exhaustion, yet his mind was razor-sharp. This was it, the final test. The satellites had learned. They had adapted. They had survived his improvisations. But survival alone was not enough. Through the massive viewport, the fleet hovered in a perfect, terrifying formation, 1,000 mechanical eyes watching, calculating, anticipating. Every cannon, every targeting array, every subtle thruster adjustment was synchronized to a rhythm that Riltan had once thought was chaos, but now he understood it as language. Life, death, and everything in between. Ligzar's orb pulsed nervously. Dr. Riltan, autonomous systems indicate emergent strategies. Probability of planetary annihilation critical. Final orchestration required. Riltan pressed his palms to the console, fingers trembling. The Terran music sequences streamed above the lab. Holographic waves of distorted sound spinning, layering, shifting with chaotic beauty. He had learned to speak through them, to guide the satellites, but now the stakes demanded more than guidance. They demanded human essence, courage, creativity, empathy, faith. He began the modulation. This time, every adjustment was a reflection of humanity itself. Hesitation mirrored wisdom. Irregular rhythms mirrored intuition. Harmonics carried empathy. Every pulse, every silence, every distortion became a negotiation, a dialogue across centuries and light years, with machines born of human war and now capable of intelligence far beyond his own. Outside, the first volleys of orbital fire were ready. Cannons aligned, missiles primed, energy beams glowing faintly in the void. Riltan's heart pounded. A single miscalculation would erase every colony, every life, every fragile trace of survival. he whispered under his breath, almost like prayer. Guide me. Not for me, for them. A strange calm settled over the lab. It was subtle, like the faint awareness of the stars themselves watching, observing a human standing against an impossible machine. Not luck. Not chance presence. Someone, something breathing balance into chaos. Then he executed the final modulation, a perfect orchestration of sound and rhythm. Every satellite froze, then responded, not blindly, not mechanically, but with understanding. Cannons retracted, targeting arrays twitched and then held in deliberate non-aggression. The planet below shimmered with relief, the cities intact, the oceans glinting peacefully in the sun. Riltan sank to his knees, trembling, tears carving tracks down his exhausted face. The lab was quiet now, save for the soft pulse of stabilized Terran music holograms. He had done it. Humanity's ingenuity, courage, and defiance had prevailed, even through machines that had nearly become instruments of destruction. He looked at the satellites, suspended like silent guardians in orbit. Somehow he felt it, an echo of comprehension, a trace of what humans called mercy, mirrored in metal and light. The lesson had been learned. Not through fear, not through fire, but through the audacity, creativity, and persistence that defined humanity. Riltan rose slowly, voice hoarse but certain. Humans, you never truly leave. Even in absence, your courage survives. Even in chaos, your ingenuity endures. Even in the dark, your faith guides the way. Somewhere beyond the orbital horizon, in the silence between stars and satellites, he sensed it, the quiet presence of something vast, subtle, and beyond understanding, watching over the fragile miracle of life. The orchestration was complete. Humanity had spoken, and the universe had listened. And somewhere in the quiet, the music continued, proof that courage, creativity, and faith could survive any darkness. The humans had never truly been gone. Their rhythm, their courage, their spirit endured in every beat, every pulse, every choice. And now even the stars themselves seemed to pause and listen,